So there's something I hinted at in the last video which I want to develop a little bit further. The relatedness between revelation and creation, and in fact even election and redemption. All of these things sort of are rooted in God's gratuitous providential action. You might say that before God wills to speak to creation, he first speaks creation into existence. Unlike us who need to seek out an audience to whom to speak, God actually generates the audience so as to speak to them. And this word, the speaking, is kind of in the rich sense of communicating, not just the conveying of information, but the actual sharing of something. We kind of have a negative example of this in English when we talk about communicable diseases, where something is actually passed along, right? So God draws an audience into existence, speaks to that audience, and by speaking to that audience, you could say further completes or brings to a conclusion the act of creation. So redemption or salvation, or however you want to phrase it. Now, but this just brings us back to the question of why does God actually bother to reveal at all? Or to state the question more broadly, if we're lumping these things together, why is it that God bothers to create, elect, reveal, redeem, or however you want to arrange these things? What's the reason behind it? As we saw already in the first video, God actually stands to benefit nothing from creation. We might, by the way, turn to Psalm 50 here, where God asks provocatively of Israel, rhetorically of Israel, do I drink the blood of goats? And the answer is no. And of course, this comes as a rebuke to Israel's cult in a certain situation, but it makes clear the fact that whatever Israel's up to in their institution, in their temple cult, just like whatever we're up to in the Eucharist, our thanksgiving adds nothing to God's greatness. God has no need of our praise. I've emphasized this fact because this idea that God can benefit nothing from creation is itself central for our understanding what is revealed by the very fact of revelation. It's central to our understanding why it is that God chooses to reveal. Because if on one hand we have a God who can benefit nothing and who chooses nevertheless to reveal, and as we'll see over the course of the semester, to reveal at great personal cost, at the risk of misunderstanding or at the certainty of misunderstanding, and eventually, in the person of Christ, at great personal cost. The only way to hold these two things together is to say, well, inasmuch as everybody acts for an end, acts for the sake of some good, and inasmuch as it's the case that God cannot be acting for his own good, it must be the case that God acts for the good of the created order, and specifically for the human family. So already, before we even look at the content of Revelation, from the very fact of Revelation, for the fact that it's here at all, we can discern something of God's love. Now, if I can make a little bit of an aside, this is really important because when eventually, next week, we get to opening the pages of Scripture, we already have framed for us what you might call like a hermeneutic of charity or hermeneutic of generosity, which is to say a way of interpretation that favors or looks for charity or generosity. Because if we know that the fact of Revelation itself is already a proclamation of God's love, then it has to be the case that when we set about reading and trying to interpret, what we're going to find is a further explication, a deepening of that same love, which motivates revelation in the first place. Now, in this idea that God reveals, or that God creates and reveals and redeems, not for his sake, but for ours, we catch something of a pure love such as we probably have never experienced. Aristotle, as he's picked up by Thomas, has this idea that to love is to will the good of another. Which is to say, not will in kind of the weak sense of, be well, but to actively work to bring about the good of another. This characterizes well what's happening in Revelation. God is willing the good of another. Now, in the text that I asked you to read from Deuteronomy 4, we got a little bit of a glimpse of what exactly that good is. We saw in verse 40, I believe, this understanding that Israel is going to be brought into the land and maintain the land and the blessings of the land inasmuch as they keep God's commandments. But what comes right before that in verse 39 is this idea that the whole keeping of the commandments and the benefits therefrom is really directed at the proclamation that the Lord is God. The whole aim of the keeping of the law and of the benefits that come therefrom is just a greater awareness that the Lord is God. But that's kind of a funny thing. If I'm trying to emphasize this idea that God is revealing, that God is creating and revealing, not for his good, but for ours, knowing that the Lord is God doesn't seem like very much of a good at all. It's a nice little fact. Or keeping all of these commandments, or undertaking this whole way of life, just so as to remember that fact, doesn't actually seem that beneficial at all. So what I would like us to do now is to turn away from Deuteronomy and look at some of the texts we have, or look at Dei Verbum from the Second Vatican Council, and a little snippet from Deus Caritas Est from Benedict XVI. And there we'll find a little treatment about where Christianity begins and the purpose of God's revelation. And I would like to see if you can kind of square what you find there, particularly in Dei Verbum 1 and 2, and what you've already found in Deuteronomy 4. To say it again, how is it that this revelation that the Lord is God, and sort of correlatively the whole way of life that realization entails, how is it that this is our good? If God is creating and revealing for our good, what exactly does that entail? Have a look.